Michael Higgins. A man who probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. There is so much about Michael, I thought it was worth just reviewing because there's still lots of things that probably all of us don't know. So Michael earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, magna cum laude in English and philosophy from St. Francis Xavier University. And I'm taking the dates out.
It was during the rain.
Francis Xavier was still teaching. Anyway, and then a Master of Arts from York University, and then a Bachelor of Education with a Theatre Arts specialization from the University of Toronto, and then a PhD at York University with his thesis on Thomas Martin, the silent-speaking poet. Michael is also the recipient of a Doctor of Humane Letters from Sacred Heart University and Honorary Laws Doctorate from the University of Waterloo. And you recently acquired another honorary doctorate at St. Francis, right? St. Francis Xavier. So Michael taught English and religious studies, and then he moved here to St. Jerome's and advanced through various levels from associate dean to academic dean, then vice president, and finally president and vice chancellor. This is the time when I crossed paths with Michael, where we first had an opportunity to meet each other. Since then, Michael has been at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, and then at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, and laterally after that at St. Mark's in Corpus Christi. So has lots of experience at different academic institutions in the administrative capacity as well as teaching. In addition to his academic career, I'll just finish that he is an emeritus professor now at Sacred Heart, an affiliate professor of graduate studies at the San Antonio Oblate School of Theology, and currently the Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. In addition to his academic career, Michael has been a popular columnist, meaning people like to read what he writes, not that his work is popular. They're very refined, rarefied. But in addition to that academic career, he's written, as you all know, but regularly and been a columnist for major and minor publications, like the Toronto Star, the Catholic Register, the Irish Catholic. He's a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail and the Tablet in London, England, and the Literary Review of Canada. He's done lots of radio and television documentaries and commentaries. Among his many publications, of particular interest to us here, The Jesuit Disruptor, a personal portrait of Pope Francis, The Church Needs the Laity, The Wisdom of John Henry Newman, Vatican II, A Universal Call to Holiness, Suffer the Little Children Unto Me, an open inquiry into the clerical sexual abuse scandal, co-authored with Peter Kavanaugh, Power and Peril, the Catholic Church at the Crossroads. And I just added this because I went to Fordham and I studied with the Jesuits, so the Jesuit mystique. I said once to Michael, I learned from the Jesuits, but I never really learned about the Jesuits. He says, well, you have to read my book, The Jesuit Mystique. So I got it. Michael has received more awards than I can list here, but he's been honored many times in many ways. Michael and his wife Christina, who we are rejoicing to have with us, a professional musician and liturgical musician, and very accomplished in her own right. So we are very grateful to have both Michael and Christina here. And on a personal level, I want to thank Michael for being, Michael was probably not long after I talked to Sister Nuala way back. Michael and I started meeting and talking and having lunch. And he's a big reason why we're here today as well. So many of the connections I've made with people in this room have been facilitated through Michael Higgins. And I just want to say on a personal note, I've never come away from a conversation or a blog of Michael's where I didn't learn a new word that I didn't. And I love language, so I love that. And then the other thing is just to say that he has such a heart. He is a kind, with all the accomplishments, Michael is a kind, generous, caring person who has given me nothing but support, and I just want to go on record as saying I am eternally grateful for that. And after today, after he talks, Michael will be back over there. A new publication is coming out from Michael in the fall, is it? Or soon, anyway. In the Synod Diary, Michael was in Rome for both sessions, general sessions, both Octobers, and was under contract with Paul's Press to produce a publication. It's called A Synod Diary, 60 Days That Shook the Church. So watch for that one coming out. Thanks, everybody. Michael.
That was a clever strategy on Kathy's part to speak so long that it reduces the length of my own. God, she's clever. Now I know what you're thinking of. Okay, you're thinking he's going to talk about the hope. Okay, we've been having conversations for a few days now. Intense liturgies. Deep reflection, constant reading. God, I hope he doesn't go on too long. We need to eat, we need to relax and everything. And I'm here to tell you that that hope is futile. But I will keep it somewhat truncated because, well, it just keeps disappearing the time here. I'm already 25 minutes into my slot, but I haven't even said anything yet. In one sense, I don't actually need to, because the hope that that's been generated, the hope that has been a defining signature of this synodal gathering, is the product of the hope of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the fact that the Synodality project, his ecclesiological interest in this project, wasn't driven, in fact, by him. Now, Pope Leo XIV will have the challenge of continuing this, of course, and we do realize that Francis recognized that this comes out of the Second Vatican Council itself. So it's not an entirely new project, but it is an important one that's evolved out of the Church's reflection and thinking, and it is driven by the particular passion and by the hope of Pope Francis. So he is the Pope. So let me just reflect on a few of these things for us to put our own considerations and reflections the last couple of days in context. But I want to start by setting the tone. Let me quote from my dear friend, who is now actually very ill, and that is the Vatican commentator, Robert Higgins. He sent out a letter recently indicating that he has 4th stage brain cancer, and he spoke to his friends and to his readers throughout the world to talk about how serene he's become around this, and that in no small part this is the result of Pope Francis, of whom he could be, and quite justifiably, critical on occasion. But here's what he says, not in relation to that particular letter, but shortly before it. It was not until Wednesday, April the 23rd, that I finally had a few moments to myself, and I was able to process what had happened just 2 days earlier. But we don't realize until a little later with the subsequent letter, he's not only talking about the death of Pope Francis, he's talking about the gravity of his own disease. Coincidentally, it was my birthday, and I became very emotional as I reflected on the death of a man who had gradually become extremely significant to my Christian faith over his 12 years as Bishop of Rome. One of the first things that came to mind was his opening greeting on July 22nd, 2013, when he arrived in Rio de Janeiro for World Youth Day. I was on that first papal plane for the visit. This is what he said. It is loving providence, God willed, that the first international trip of my pontificate should take me back to my beloved Latin America, specifically to Brazil. I have learned that to gain access to the Brazilian people, it is necessary to pass through its great heart. So let me knock gently at this door, and let me ask permission to come in and to spend this time with you. End of that reflection by Pope Francis himself. Robert uses that as a wonderful example of what it means to rule with the heart. Now, he can also rule with the temper, and he can rule in other ways as well, but his primary way of ruling was with the heart. And the heart is connected to hope. That's why he's the Hope Pope. In 2025, we had Spes non confundit, which was the bull of benediction of the ordinary jubilee of the year 2025. Here's what he said in this bull of benediction, establishing the jubilee year. It helps us to realize what he meant by hope. Everyone knows what it is to hope. In the heart of each person, hope dwells as the desire and expectation of good things to come, despite our not knowing what the future may bring. Even so, uncertainty about the future may at times give rise to conflicting feelings, ranging from confident trust to apprehensiveness, from serenity to anxiety, from firm conviction to hesitation and to doubt. Often we come across people who are discouraged, they are pessimistic, and they are cynical about the future, as if nothing could possibly bring them happiness. For all of us, may the Jubilee be an opportunity to be renewed in hope. God's Word helps us find reasons for that hope. And taking it as our guide, let us return to the message that the Apostle Paul wished to communicate to the Christians in Rome, when he said, "Since we are justified through faith, we have peace through God and our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we boast in our hope of sharing in the glory of God." Hope does not disappoint, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Now, this is what he says in the Bull of Benediction, but it could just as easily serve as an epigraph to his later writings, or even perhaps an epitaph, if it weren't for the fact that he chose simply to have the name Franciscus actually stamped on the head of his tombstone. So, hope and humility. Francis offered during his pontificate a vision or understanding of hope in a series of general audience reflections from December 2016 through to March 2017, and from these let me draw just two passages. So hope as a theme, as a thread running through the pontificate of the teaching of Pope Francis is not confined to one document alone. It's a defining feature of his Petrine ministry, and it surfaces in several different ways. So here's just two passages to show you why hope is intricately connected with two other dimensions of human being and flourishing. One is, and here in the passage from one of these audience locutions that he gave in Rome, attention is important in dealing with our brothers and sisters who are most at risk of losing hope, of succumbing to despair. We always hear news of people who succumb to despair and that they do bad things, because despair leads them to do many bad things. We are speaking of one who is discouraged, one who is weak, one who feels down by the burden of life, and one of whose own faults, and one who no longer manages to pick himself or herself up. In these cases, the closeness and warmth of the entire church must be even more intense and loving, and must take on the exquisite form of compassion, which is not simply sympathy. Compassion is to endure with the other, to suffer with the other, to draw near to the one who is suffering. a word, a caress, but given from the heart. Now this is compassion for the one who needs comfort and consolation. This is more important than ever. Christian hope cannot do without genuine and concrete charity. Now this is, again, another sub-theme that runs through Francis's ministry and through his writing. And that is, in the order of priority, it is reality that takes precedence over ideas. It is the importance of enfleshment, of an incarnational rather than an abstract construct that defines the essence of Christian witness. So if we are to be compassionate, we have to be compassionate with someone. Not as an abstraction, not as an idealistic entity, but in the real world, broken, flawed, shattered, the occupants of the field hospital. That's where compassion is to be found, and that's where hope is to be found. Because the alternative to hope, of course, is despair, and that has no place in the Christian dispensation, though it is a very common feature in our own lives. The other key thing to defining hope with its unique Christian iteration is solidarity. We're not alone. We understand that we do not learn to hope alone. No one hopes alone. They despair alone, but they don't hope alone. No one learns to hope alone. It is impossible. Hope, to be nourished, necessarily needs a body in which the various members support and revive each other. This means then that if we hope, it is because many of our brothers and sisters have taught us to hope and have kept hope alive. Distinguishable among them are the little ones, the poor, the simple, and the marginalized, because one who is enclosed within his own well-being does not know hope. He hopes only in his well-being, and this is not hope. It is relative security. One who is enclosed in his own fulfillment always feels that all is well, but does not know hope. What such a person knows, of course, is delusion. We see its face everywhere, right? In the political world, particularly now. Not only now, but particularly now. And with great and unnerving intensity. Francis denounces what he calls the sin of auto-referentiality. And it's a problem that's also at the heart of the church when it occupies itself or obsesses about its own rules, about its order, its protocols, its dignities, its reputation. It fights over and squabbles over minor points of doctrine or some papal decree, when in fact the church is called to be a witness to the world, to stand in compassion, to inject hope, to be vessels of love to the world, not to itself and not to individuals alone. So hope is an active virtue. It's not something that is passive or static in Francis' thinking. If you're to hope, you're to be present in the world. You're to be an agent of change in the world. Now, it's not only his various talks on hope. It is not only his indiction on the occasion of creating a jubilee year around hope. He actually has an autobiography called Hope. So if you're not sure where this came from, if you're not sure that, well, where did hope come from, it's him. Now, of course, he is alarmingly autobiographical. He's given many interviews. He's always talking. And he's sometimes makes some changes, subtle, and sometimes not so subtle. He's not unique in this, by the way. It was Pope John Paul II that began the process of popes actually conducting interviews with individuals. It was André Frossard who wrote that early work in the 1980s, Do Not Be Afraid, which was a series of conversations. Benedict XVI did it regularly. He had his favorite German journalist with whom he co-authored several things with an autobiographical flavor. So to say, well, Francis talks about himself all the time. No other pope has ever done this. Oh, yes, they have. No, they have, and in abundance. But Francis's way of doing this is a little unpolished, right? It's from the heart all the time. And now that he's dead, criticism around his speaking from the heart spontaneously and whatnot is now surfacing with a certain legitimacy, which I find personally alarming, but not surprising. Because when a public figure disappears, and then we have all these wonderful obsequies and tributes and paeans and eulogies and everything else, then we move into the next phase, which is to move to a new level of papal saturation. So the new guy is the best thing that's ever happened in the history of the church, and the old guy begins to recede somewhat in terms of prominence. This is a standard historical pattern, and it's not surprising. So keep in mind, as Francis begins to somewhat recede from public view, understandably, he's dead. and there's a new Peter in Rome, that makes sense. But his abiding presence and the essential qualities that he established by humanizing the papacy will not, I think, be undone by his successor. One can make and have wonderful conversations about where this is going to go. It's still too early. We'll see the level and the intensity and commitment to which Leo XIV brings to the concepts of synodality. It's an important thing to observe and to keep an eye on. Precisely because he was at the synod, he gives every evidence of believing in synodality, but it might not be quite the same way. Francis, in Hope, an autobiography, spends some time talking about the necessity for hope when dealing with what he calls awkwardly. Now, you're never quite sure whether this is the translator or him, but he wasn't the most polished literary dude on the planet. So every now and then you get a word that really you think, my God, couldn't we get a better word than this? But he called it backwardism. Okay? Backwardism. Now, there were various instances of backwardism that he felt, were a threat to the real potency and generativity of hope itself. One was the liturgy wars, which we still have, right? The altar wars. He tried his best, better than many think, to bring a cessation to these conflicts. The scandal, the divisiveness, the lack of harmony, and the failure of love around the Word and the Eucharist. And one of the last documents he released was a real effort to provide an antidote, if you like, to some of the excesses that came from an earlier document by Pope Benedict, who operated, I think, from a very good motive, ironic, trying to bring some level of peace among warring Catholics over the traditionalist as opposed to the contemporary liturgy, the usus antiquior versus the noble order, and all the other wonderful ways in which we have to talk about it. But it didn't work. It actually inflamed the situation. Francis recognized that, but he didn't know quite what to do. But eventually he issued a document saying, this is the rite, this is the way it needs to be done. If there is to be the celebration in the extraordinary rite, because there really is only one rite, but it's the extraordinary version of that rite, then it has to be done through specific control and request through the local ordinary. And people criticized him. Insensitivity to the liturgy and to the minority of Catholics, who are increasingly, it would seem, in some jurisdictions, younger Catholics, showed a lack of pastoral sensitivity. But this wasn't Francis's initiative alone. In fact, primarily it was an initiative from the Episcopal conferences all over the world that asked the Pope to intervene because the liturgy wars were dividing their parishes and their churches. Francis was responding to their request. The liturgy wars are ugly. You hardly ever win with them. They're deeply divisive around the very altar that should bring unity. Francis also saw the necessity of hope when dealing with a culture of what he calls courtliness, in which he's basically referring to the operations within the Vatican itself. Now, many of us know that Francis is not a model of human resources enlightenment. He chose every year to berate the Curia at their Christmas parade. So everybody Catholics, and he denounces them for being Pharisees, although then he was subsequently corrected by the chief rabbi on that one, but he spends a good deal of time berating them, all right? But he doesn't do it caustically, well, he does actually caustically, but he doesn't do it out of contempt for it, because he identifies himself always as the center. This is me too who fails, okay? And so one of the things about the courtliness in the Vatican that this so deeply disappointed him was that it alienated the ministers from their own calling. And so he would take time to actually intervene publicly and denounce young clerics and seminarians and maybe older clerics that obsessed about their raiment, their garments, their rosettas and rochets and everything else that they dug up from the past, that established their unique entitlement and dignity. He saw this as contra the meaning of the Presbyterate. This is not what Jesus wanted. Okay? And so when you see Francis sporting slimmed down versions of his office, this isn't just a fashion statement, nor is it a glib observation, well, this is the way I work, I've always worked this way, I don't like clutter, and so on. It's also, as all symbols and gestures are, a substantive statement of what you believe. So courtliness was a thing that, he calls it courtliness, we mean something different when we say something's courtly, but he means court-specific. Is not good. But hope lies in the language of synodality. There's a marvelous passage in Hope, an Autobiography, in which he talks about what synodality means to him. Now, it's not framed in the arcane language of theologians and canonists and ecclesiastical historians. It's the language of a pastor. Okay? But it draws on those other resources, of course, because they're indispensable. But it's framed and spoken of as a pastor. I don't want walls, he says. Synodality is a momentum, it is a drive to unity and understanding, it's participatory. Now he doesn't like to use the word democracy. No Vatican prelate ever likes to use the word democracy. They've been fighting that since the Syllabus of Errors in the 19th century. But he does understand it's about consensus, about what really community means. And so for Francis, synodality isn't an affectation, it is not an adornment, it's not a divertissement. It is speaks to the very heart of the Church's mission and his understanding of ecclesiology. Hope is also encounter. It's also an essential component or ingredient for theological investigation. In a work that appeared only a few months, it appeared a few months after, let me get this right. It appeared a few hours after the end of the first session of the Synod on Synodality. It was a document called Ad Theologiam Promovendum, promoting theology. It's an apostolic letter or motu proprio. It wasn't written just by him, and it was to deal with various statutes and ordinances concerning pontifical faculties of theology, kind of an adjournamental and updating of the discipline. But it is very interesting about what he says about the role of theology, and it's very interesting about what it says by implication for all of us, articulate, literate, informed about our faith, what we are to understand and what we are to be commissioned to do. So let me just quote this, because I think it's a good section to quote, and also because I wrote it. And one of the many qualities that Francis had that I don't have is humility. Okay, here we go. The document I just mentioned, called Ad Theologiam Promovendum, is a crystallization of much of his thinking around the role of theology itself. Now, Francis is not shy in declaring that the science of theology is called to a turning point, to a paradigm shift, to a courageous cultural revolution. Called, in fact, to become a fundamentally contextual theology, by which he means a theology that must be, and I quote, capable of reading and interpreting the gospel in the conditions in which women and men live daily, in different geographical, social, and cultural environments. Theology cannot but take place in a culture of dialogue and encounter between different traditions and knowledge, between religions, openly confronting all believers and non-believers alike." End of quote. Now, in addition to invoking the insight of the Italian thinker Antonio Rosmini, who argued that all knowledge is oriented toward the idea of wisdom, Francis, with his fondness for emblematic symbols like the polyhedron, the pyramid, and the balancing dance of the contraries, or human and ecclesial tensions, is attracted to the idea of wisdom holding truth and charity together eternally in a solid circle, so that it is impossible to know the truth without practicing charity. Listen to that. It is impossible to know the truth without practicing charity. Now, this papal summons to get theologians onto the streets, to be pioneers in effecting a cultural revolution, is not a diminishment of intellectual rigor or a departure from ecclesial connectedness, but rather a clarion call for meaningful and credible witness. Theology in the marketplace need not mean that theology in the academy is to be abandoned. Rather, by being aware of Bernard Lonergan's shift of consciousness from a classicist to historicist model, Francis is committed to an enlivening theological enterprise, rooted in the reality of the people, grounded in experience, not ideology, a science that is a way of life open to an endlessly unfolding culture of encounter, and sustained and infused by hope. You know, I attended the two synod sessions, but not as a synod delegate like Kathy and Linda and Ray, who was a facilitator. I was there as a journalist sent by Paul's Press in New York to cover it. So I spent most of my time at press conferences listening to various of the delegates come and respond to specific questions from the floor in the Stampa della Santa Sede of the press office, OBC. Very interesting dynamic, very interesting things that were done. One of the things that struck me in 23 and in 24 was the fact that Francis and the synod delegates themselves were aware of the fact that what went on in the aula, what went on in the hall at their tables, like we are doing now, should not be seen as an insulation, an entombment, a cocooning, keeping out the world. And so there were various instances in 2023 and 2024 when they would talk about what was happening outside that hall, what was happening in the world at large. One of the things constantly occupying Francis's attention was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then latterly the war in Gaza. So the aula was not seen, or the delegates were not seen, and we should not see, that the work that we have done here in this reflection, this microcosm of the larger synod, we shouldn't see as some kind of an isolated activity, an indulgence in some kind of special pastoral and aesthetic mode, and then when we leave here, it's really not about the larger world. It is about the larger world, and that's why we're here. So I want to end, because hope is the key here, and I want to remind us that as we sit in this room, there are parts of the world that are ablaze. And it is very possible, not probable, but very possible, that we sit on the cusp of a Holocaust, a nuclear Holocaust. If the situation in Tehran and Tel Aviv does not move to some kind of resolution, then the exaggerated rhetoric, of course, of the President of the United States that the 10 million occupants of Tehran should leave immediately. This is his warning. And the one thing covering Trump over the years in some respects for NPR and for Commonweal, he does what he says he's going to do. That's why we're in the mess we're in. What he says he's going to do may change every 24 hours. within that rarefied and truncated historical moment of reflection, he does tend to do what he feels is right. So as we look at this, and I was thinking as we were driving in today, with Christine and I were driving in from Guelph, thinking about the Cold War letters, thinking about Thomas Merton working with Pope John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd working behind the scenes with Khrushchev and members of the Kennedy administration and diffusing the situation that did in fact imperil the world. I am not as old as Kathy might suggest I am. I do not go back to the reign of Leo XIII. I do remember as a child growing up in Toronto, walking home in 62, 63 from high school, being told where we were to lie on the curb when the sounds came and announcing the possible arrival of a nuclear bomb. 1962, 1963. So, I mean, that's not that many years ago. So the importance of recognizing the need for hope in a time of a darkening landscape. We should look to the consolations, if you like, that are often provided by the witnesses to peace. And one of them, and I'll end with this, is an article that appeared, "What is Hope Right Now?" And this is someone who loved Pope Francis. It's David Newhouse. David Newhouse is a Jesuit political scientist who teaches in Jerusalem. He's unusual in that he was born Jewish, became a Jesuit, so, you know, that means he's likely a Christian. I can say that with impunity. I've written a couple of books about Jesuits, so I think they can trust that I'm on their side. But he's also a Palestinian. So he speaks Hebrew, he's born Jewish, he's a Roman Catholic convert, he's a political scientist, and he lives in Palestine. And this article that appeared not too long ago, but it takes on an increased intensity right now, given the situation in the Holy Land, particularly in the West Bank. He says, hope is rooted in the experience of God who loves us. Hope is the life force that seeks to make me and you witnesses to a humanity that is being extinguished in a world that turns away from those falling by the side of the road. Hope resources resilience that pushes on despite everything. My prayer is that this hope resists the growing despair. Now he's at the nexus, he's at the heart of the maelstrom. So he's experiencing it intensely. If that was true a month or so ago, it's even more true now. But what sustains him is this Christian hope. And it is that hope that Pope Francis articulated in his letters, in his Bull of Benediction, in his autobiography, and several other places in his writings and in his homilies. That hope is that which prevents us from eventually succumbing to that deepest disappointment that undermines us, our humanity, our civilization. With compassion, with solidarity, building on the hope that is grounded in the Carpenter's Son, recognizing indeed that as we move forward globally, and recognizing always that the muck and mire and viscera of reality is always superior to the comfort and the isolation of just thinking about it. Thank you.